The beginning of the Great Patriotic War was a tremendous test for the Soviet Union and its leader. June 1941 will forever be remembered as a time of sudden attack and turmoil. In this brief introduction, we will immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty that gripped the country in the first hours of the war, a feeling that the whole world had been turned upside down in an instant. On the international stage, the beginning of 1941 was filled with tension and uncertainty. Hitler's Germany was preparing for a powerful offensive in the east, but in Moscow, people still did not fully believe in the inevitability of this blow. The Third Reich's intelligence services carefully concealed their plans, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Cautious optimism prevailed in the Kremlin, and Stalin insisted that war could be prevented, even though intelligence services were already picking up alarming signals. The Soviet leadership tried to balance between faith in peace and preparation for the worst-case scenario. The internal state of the Soviet Union in the first months of 1941 was far from clear. The mass repressions of the late 1930s left deep scars on society and the army. Senior officials and officers lived in a state of constant anxiety, as mistakes could cost lives. Despite this, the country continued to develop rapidly, managing to build up its industrial power and strengthen its defense capabilities. The people waited for their leaders and relied on their strong will to win. The first days of the war were marked by shock. The sudden invasion of the Soviet Union's borders, the rapid advance of German troops, and the destruction of many defenses caused panic and confusion. Defenses were hastily constructed, and the front lines shifted with terrifying speed. In Moscow, it was understood that they were facing a test of historic importance. Stalin's personality made many wonder. Was he caught too off guard? Or was this just a carefully thought-out drama to achieve a strategic goal? On the eve of the war, the Soviet leadership was a complex organism with many contradictions. Stalin combined the qualities of a ruthless dictator with those of a deeply analytical head of state. Among his closest associates, there were disputes about the readiness for war, the danger of underestimating the enemy, and the necessary mobilization of resources. Many of these discussions remained behind the scenes, hidden from the public eye and sometimes even from the leader himself, who relied on his intuition and unwavering determination. The history of that period is full of dramatic moments and mysteries. It is known that in the first hours of the war, the Soviet command was unable to respond quickly to the offensive. This was a consequence not only of the surprise of the attack, but also of existing gaps in personnel training and communication. Conspiracy theories sometimes try to explain this as betrayal or a deep strategic game, but most historians agree that the reason lay in a combination of factors, including Stalin's personal responsibility. The surge of anxiety and global changes forced Soviet citizens to mobilize all their resources and strength. However, it should not be forgotten that before the war, there was still a strong sense of patriotism and loyalty to communist ideology among the population. This became one of the important factors in their resilience during the most difficult trials. The leaders of the party nomenclature tried to quickly rebuild the economy and military production, realizing that the fate of the country and the whole world was being decided at that very moment. The first week after the attack was decisive for the further course of events. Despite the apparent paralysis, by the end of June, Stalin had already shown himself to be not just a shocked leader, but also a strategist with a unique approach to waging war. His decisions, though seemingly harsh and sometimes incomprehensible, were aimed at maximizing the mobilization and unity of the country. This period became a test of the strength of the entire political system and the personal authority of the leader. At the same time, events were unfolding on the front lines, where Soviet troops were trying to stop the Wehrmacht's advance. Their difficult and bloody struggle highlighted the indomitable spirit of the people and, at the same time, revealed shortcomings in command and training. Despite all the difficulties and losses, by the middle of the summer, the Soviet Union began to rebuild its defenses, calling for a massive effort from every citizen. This turning point marked the beginning of a new era in the country's history. An important aspect was the internal information space. Soviet propaganda sought to boost morale by concealing the extent of the disaster and portraying the enemy as doomed to defeat. This created a unique mental climate where fear was mixed with hope. Stalin understood that the struggle was being waged not only on the battlefields, but also in the minds of millions. Each of his speeches was carefully crafted to strengthen faith and prepare people for a long, hard struggle. Over time, it became clear that Stalin in 1941 was not simply a victim of circumstances, but a personality who used the drama of the situation to achieve his strategic goals. His image at that time remains complex and ambiguous, directly reflecting the drama of the entire country. Behind the veil of official statements lay deep reflections on strength and weakness, on the price of victory and the inevitable sacrifices. The end of the sixth month of 1941 was already bearing the first fruits of struggle and steadfastness. The Soviet Union began to clearly understand that the war would be long and brutal. Stalin tightened control, ordered production to be accelerated, and new types of weapons to be created. Behind all this was the goal not just to survive, but to win. The next stage of history unfolded amid the mobilization of all capacities and resources, where the personal Grandmaster talent of the leader would become the decisive factor. Moving on to new events and analyzing further strategies, we must leave behind the first days of paralysis and surprise. The greatest test was still ahead, and it would determine how Stalin's team would be able to outdo the enemy. The next period would reveal a difficult path of struggle, victories, and losses that would change the fate of the world forever. In the distant June of 1941, the Soviet Union suddenly found itself on the brink of the greatest battle in its history. The Great Patriotic War began its terrible march, and at this critical moment, the whole world watched the behavior of its leader, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. Who was he then? A paralyzed and confused leader, incapable of making quick decisions, or a grandmaster of strategy, masterfully planning every move? In this text, we delve into the complex and contradictory image of a man who was responsible for the fate of millions. We examine not only the external manifestations of power, but also internal conflicts, psychological background, and mechanisms of control. By the beginning of the war, Joseph Stalin was already a veteran of party struggles and had spent decades building his system of power. His image is often perceived as the embodiment of iron will and determination. But in 1941, the outside world was already seeing cracks in this facade. Some historians note his paralysis in the face of the unexpected lightning attack by German troops, while others stubbornly argue that Stalin remained calm and secretly prepared countermeasures. The reason for the contradictions lies in the fact that access to the full picture of events remains closed, and Stalin himself keeps his secrets. The psychological state of the leader in those days is often described as tense and even anxious. Several times during the first weeks of the war, he disappeared from public view, causing concern among Soviet and foreign observers. At the same time, according to his closest associates, Stalin intensively studied reports from the front and demanded a detailed analysis of each situation. His management style was characterized by a combination of strict discipline and unexpected flexibility. He was tough on generals, sometimes accusing them of not doing enough, while also getting involved in developing new strategies. The growing disaster that summer showed the Soviet command's weaknesses, but Stalin, with his sharp political intuition, managed to keep the party and the army together. He rewrote personnel policy, replaced commanders, and carefully removed reactionary elements. It can be assumed that these actions bear the hallmarks of a seasoned strategist using the crisis to consolidate his power and optimize military potential. However, the mystery remains. Were these changes the result of a long-term plan, or improvisation caused by the pressure of circumstances. Particularly noteworthy is the moment when Stalin made a harsh appeal to the people, urging them not to give in to panic and to mobilize. These speeches contained not only patriotic sentiment, but also a characteristic element of fear, emphasizing the inevitability of harsh measures. They revealed the leader not only as a symbol of power, but also as a man balancing on the brink of despair and determination. From time to time, it became apparent that Stalin was aware of the seriousness of the threat, but did not want to show weakness in order to maintain the morale of the population. It is equally important to note the role of the secret services and intelligence at this time. Stalin had a sophisticated information network, which was not always able to provide reliable data. Among the well-known mistakes was the miscalculation of the timing and scale of the German offensive, which led to the paralysis being interpreted not so much as weakness as the result of false initial information. However, by the end of the year, the situation gradually stabilized thanks to the actions of Stalin himself, who influenced the preparations for the famous Battle of Moscow. How did weakness and power, fear and composure coexist in one man? The answer lies in a complex mosaic of personality traits. He knew how to wait and analyze, but sometimes he doubted himself. His decisions were controversial and sometimes unpredictable, but it was precisely this combination of qualities that created his unique management style. Even decades later, it remains a mystery whether he was a paralyzed leader, confused in the face of disaster, or a grandmaster who knew when to strike back and when to bend under the blows of the enemy. Historians continue to debate, relying on archival materials, memoirs of contemporaries, and psychological studies. One of the key conclusions is the realization that at critical moments, the fate of an entire country can depend on a personality that combines seemingly incompatible qualities. Stalin in 1941 appears as a complex paradox, and his role cannot be simplified. Sometimes strength lay not in swift action, but in endurance and calculation. In concluding this study, it is important to mention that the transition to the next stage of the war opens not only new pages in military history, but also further reveals Stalin's personality in the context of war and political trials. How he behaved in the face of new challenges largely determined the outcome of the Great Struggle. That is why the next section is devoted to the most fateful moments when the leader showed whether he was capable of emerging from the crisis even stronger and wiser. The first weeks after the start of the Great Patriotic War remain one of the most controversial and dramatic periods in the history of the Soviet Union. It was at this time that the fates of millions were decided, the future of the country was determined, and the course of world history was set. Today, we will try to discern the true face of Joseph Stalin during those terrible months. Was he paralyzed by fear and confusion? Or was he thinking up cunning strategic moves, hidden from the eyes of the majority? June 22, 1941, was a time of unprecedented shock for the Red Army and the entire Soviet leadership. The idea of a lightning invasion by Hitler's Germany seemed incredible at the time, even though intelligence reports at the end of spring had warned of the imminent danger. However, preparations for war were complicated not only by external threats, but also by internal upheavals, including large-scale purges of the Army's command structure in previous years. Complex and dangerous processes were taking place at the very heart of the Soviet military apparatus. Despite all his charisma and iron will, Stalin seemed confused to some historians in the early days of the war. His well-known delays in issuing orders and his late appeals to the people raise questions. But behind this apparent paralysis lay a carefully thought-out mechanism working toward the main goal: preserving the integrity of the country and defeating the invader. One of the key aspects of the beginning of the war was the creation of the Smolensk defensive line, designed as a barrier against the rapid advance of German tanks. However, the scale of the attack exceeded all expectations. Was Stalin's idea of mounting effective resistance in the face of a sudden and powerful blow realistic? It is worth paying attention to his dialogues with military advisors, which reveal not only anxiety, but also strategic foresight. Among the top military leaders, Georgy Zhukov and Kliment Voroshilov stood out. Their relationship with the leader was a vast field for maneuvers and compromises. It is important to remember that the most important decisions were made in an atmosphere of constant pressure and risk. Stalin demanded incredible discipline from his subordinates, while he himself developed a strategy that not only slowed the enemy's advance, but also laid the groundwork for a counteroffensive. The psychological aspect should not be forgotten either. In the first months of the war, the leader showed himself not only as a strategist, but also as a symbol of steadfastness and unyielding will. His speeches on the radio and in the press were aimed at mobilizing millions of citizens, creating an atmosphere of hope and preventing panic. At the same time, Stalin's personal role became increasingly prominent in the formation of command personnel and the organization of the rear. Of particular importance is an analysis of the orders and directives that came out of the Kremlin during that period. Some of them seem cruel and sometimes counterproductive from the point of view of military experts. But when viewed in the context of the time and the lack of complete information, Stalin's desire to maintain control and prevent chaos among the troops and the civilian population becomes understandable. This discipline, despite its harshness, played a key role in the survival of the Soviet Union in the first months of the war. One of the most important episodes was the defense of Moscow. Here, the full drama of the situation unfolded. The enemy advanced relentlessly, leaving destruction and devastation in its wake. At the same time, the strategic decisions made by the leader and his closest associates combined elements of improvisation and deep analysis. Unexpected countermeasures, the organization of partisan movements, and the strengthening of defensive lines created a picture in which Stalin appeared not only as a leader, but also as the conductor of a huge and complex defense mechanism. Intelligence also played an important role, which, despite initial failures, gradually began to provide valuable information about the enemy's intentions and actions. This allowed the Soviet command to assess the situation more accurately and make more informed decisions. In particular, the use of strategies based on partial retreat in order to preserve forces became evidence of miscalculations, but also of the ability to adjust course under inevitable pressure. The dialogue between Stalin and Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov illustrates the complexities of interaction between political leadership and professional military personnel. The conflicts and compromises that arose during this period reflected not only personal ambitions, but also the urgent need to develop a unified tactic. Ultimately, these difficult relationships contributed to the emergence of a new format of military leadership, which introduced the concepts of centralized decision-making and strict control. Many historians tend to view the situation at the beginning of the war through the prism of defeats and mistakes. However, a deeper analysis shows that it was precisely during these first critical months that the foundations for subsequent victory were laid. Despite criticism, Stalin managed to mobilize enormous resources and people, directing them to defend the homeland and build a strategy capable of withstanding the onslaught of one of the world's most powerful military machines. This duality in Stalin's image, both a paralyzed leader and a grandmaster of strategy, raises many questions and legends. It cannot be unequivocally stated that his role was limited to cruelty or short-sightedness. The leader's actions also included elements of careful planning and the ability to learn from defeat, quickly adapting to the dynamics of military conflict. Thus, the first months of the war represent a complex puzzle of personal qualities and decisions, external circumstances, and internal processes. In this kaleidoscope, Stalin played a far from one-dimensional role. He was simultaneously a challenge to those around him and a pillar of support for the country at a time of complete turmoil and catastrophe. An analysis of this period helps to understand the depth of the tragedy and the scale of courage that marked Soviet history. Moving on to the next set of events, it is important not to lose sight of the new challenges facing the Soviet state after the protracted setbacks and initial counterattacks. It was in this later phase of the war that new features emerged not only in Stalin's character, but also in the entire military command system, leading to decisive victories and defeats. At the very beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thin thread of fear, trust, and strict control. In the face of a sudden attack and mortal danger, every step taken by the top leadership became decisive. At the center of this whirlwind stood Joseph Stalin, a leader whose methods of governance in those critical months inspired not only admiration, but also horror. How did the mechanisms of control and suppression of dissent allow him to retain power? And what does this mean for understanding the course of military events? Strict supervision and an atmosphere of fear were integral elements of Stalin's power long before the war began. During the years of Great Repression in the 1920s and 1930s, many members of the command structure were eliminated, creating an alarming vacuum. By the beginning of 1914, the level of trust between the top echelons was extremely low. Stalin, aware of the risks, did not allow the slightest sign of independence or doubt among his subordinates, which often affected decisions concerning the front. Mass repression created an atmosphere where any mistake or failure was perceived as treason. Commanders were forced not only to fight the enemy, but also to struggle with an uncertain future, not knowing what incredible consequences a mistake or weakness could entail. For example, many tank commanders were repressed immediately after the start of the war, often as a result of denunciations or suspicions of disloyalty. This climate fostered uncertainty and fear of making independent decisions. The use of special NKVD units ensured strict control over the army leadership and the population. Military commanders and commissars were closely linked to party structures and constantly monitored discipline and prevented any signs of dissent. Extraordinary measures included mass searches, arrests, and even executions without lengthy investigations, which, on the one hand, deterred possible protests, but on the other hand, created internal instability and paranoia. Stalin and his inner circle ruthlessly eliminated anyone who was suspicious or considered a potential traitor. Secrecy and isolation of information were key to the Kremlin's work. High-ranking officers received strictly rationed information, often sent in a distorted form. As a result, local commanders were not always able to get a complete picture of events. This deliberate restriction of information was a tool for maintaining control. Stalin believed that this was the only way he could manage the process and hold on to power even during periods of inevitable difficulties and defeats. But this approach had a downside. In his usual manner, Stalin actively used ideological repression. Any criticism of the leadership was tantamount to an act of hostility. Only those who were prepared for tragic consequences could afford to speak out or express doubts. At the same time, not only the military command but also the general population was under enormous pressure. A network of informers and informers grew, fueling an atmosphere of mistrust and doubt. One of the most terrifying tools was the process of show trials. There are known cases when arrested officers and party officials publicly confessed to sabotage and subversion, often under torture. Such scenes served not only to intimidate the troops, but also to propagate the infallibility and inerrancy of Stalin's power. This created a culture in which any disobedience was considered deadly dangerous and unacceptable, even when leaders were aware of mistakes made by those at the top. Internal frontline politics isolated the top leadership from real reports. Information about failures on the Western Front reached them with a noticeable delay or in a distorted form. This created a false sense of confidence in the leader. Although Stalin tried to keep the situation under control, he often found that decisions were made without taking into account the current situation. Distrust of the generals exacerbated these problems, as many of them were reluctant to report their failures for fear of reprisals. It is equally important to note the role of Stalin's personal entourage in maintaining this system. Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, ruthlessly tracked down any signs of dissent, reporting directly to the leader. Molotov, Kalinin, and other close associates were both executors of decisions and observers. Their tasks included not only organizing repressions, but also forming a united front among the highest echelons of power. At such moments, the entire political machine worked like a well-oiled mechanism for combating internal threats. The suppression of dissent had serious consequences for the effectiveness of the military machine. On the one hand, discipline and order kept the army from chaos and collapse, but on the other hand, fear limited initiative and responsibility. Commanders couldn't afford to be independent, and without that, flexibility and adaptability suffered. The losses in the first months of the war were enormous, many of them due precisely to the lack of quick decision-making and deep understanding between headquarters and regiments. Despite all the challenges and shortcomings, it was this harsh system that allowed Stalin to hold on to power in the most difficult hours. Fear and control became a kind of cement that held together the disparate forces of the Soviet state. Internal strife and conflict were paralyzed by repression and punishment, which led to the formation of a solid core of loyalty and obedience. This phenomenon deserves close attention and is key to understanding both the personality of the leader and the course of military events. At the same time, it should not be forgotten that in these conditions, traces of doubt appeared even among the Soviet leaders closest to Stalin. Some of the command staff tried to find ways to circumvent party prohibitions, secretly discussing strategy and possibilities for the development of the front without regard for central control. These processes, despite the repression, testified to an indomitable desire for victory even under conditions of suppression of freedom of thought, which became one of the dramatic features of that time. Thus, the methods of control and suppression of dissent in the Soviet Union in 1941 constituted a complex network of repression, fear, and ideological pressure that contributed to the preservation of Stalin's power. Despite criticism and contradictions, they became the foundation of the country's governance during a critical period. This reality affected all levels of society and literally shaped the course of the Great Patriotic War with its tragedies and heroism. Moving on to further analysis, it is worth paying attention to how the strategies and tactics of war were reflected in Stalin's personal qualities and his role in history. Because the leader could have been not only a man paralyzed by fear, but also a Grandmaster of great strategy. The following sections reveal this side of the leader's personality and the consequences of his decisions for the fate of the entire country. At the very beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the image of the leader of the Soviet people became not just an important element of state policy, but also a key instrument of psychological defense for society. In those dark and troubled days, when the hearts of millions beat with fear and uncertainty, Soviet propaganda shaped the image of Stalin not as a mere politician, but as an invincible strategist and wise leader who knew no defeat. These images sustained the belief in victory and compelled people to move forward despite the horrors of war. The variety of media at the time was quite limited, but it was through them that a powerful wave of propaganda messages was disseminated. Newspapers, radio, and posters were filled with bold statements and slogans that portrayed Stalin as an unwavering defender of the motherland. Newspapers such as Pravda and Krasnaya Zvezda reported victories even when the situation on the front lines remained difficult. Such texts served a dual purpose: to inspire the troops and to conceal information about numerous defeats. The flawless execution of the task of pulling the wool over people's eyes, not only in the depths of the USSR, but also beyond its borders, played a crucial role in creating the cult of personality. The image of Stalin as a grand master of strategy was spread even to foreign delegations and the foreign media. Soviet diplomats and propagandists took great care to ensure that the whole world perceived him as an infallible leader capable of leading the country to victory through all trials, no matter how difficult the struggle. Even in moments of danger and uncertainty, this image remained unshakable. However, behind the facade of the shining hero lay a complex reality. Losses and catastrophic defeats near Moscow, the loss of strategic cities, and widespread panic among the leadership were all carefully concealed or presented as necessary steps for future triumph. In this contrast between reality and the ideological narrative, propaganda served as a kind of shield that kept Soviet society from collapsing morally during the most difficult period of the war. At the same time, we must not forget the influence of the latest technologies and new forms of media influence. Radio, which became a mass medium of communication, broadcast daily speeches and messages calling for steadfastness and faith in the invincibility of the leader. A special role was assigned to Stalin's brilliant speeches, in which he spoke with confidence and firmness, instilling hope in the people. These broadcasts not only motivated, but also formed a united front of internal resistance to the enemy, creating a sense of unity. An equally significant part of the propaganda campaign was the culture of mass rallies and demonstrations. In these public events, Stalin took on the symbolic role of the country's greatest defender. Patriotic songs, collective choral performances, and fiery speeches by party leaders reinforced in the minds of every Soviet citizen that the country and its leader were invincible. Such events not only maintained morale, but also strengthened the sense of belonging to a common cause. Interestingly, the propaganda leaders themselves were well aware of the danger of excessive embellishment. For this reason, a certain amount of criticism and self-criticism was sometimes introduced to create an illusion of honesty and realism. This approach strengthened trust in official sources of information and prevented the spread of rumors or panic. Thus, propaganda was both a shield and a sword in the struggle for the minds of Soviet citizens. In addition, it is worth noting the influence of works of art and films of that time. Through vivid patriotic plots, Soviet cinema portrayed Stalin as a valiant commander and father of the nation who cared for his people. These images came in handy during periods of heavy fighting, when people needed inspiration to survive. Films, as a rule, did not show the war in its brutal detail, but presented it through the prism of triumph and human strength of spirit. Artistic journalistic works, poems and songs that conveyed the heroism and steadfastness of the people under the leadership of their leader also played a particularly important role. These works formed the basis of collective memory and strengthened patriotic sentiment. They filled the gaps in knowledge about the front and contributed to the formation of a nationwide myth about victory, for which every citizen was required to fight. In conclusion, it is worth saying that the role of Soviet propaganda during those terrible war years was integral and multifaceted. It was not only created to boost morale, but also served as a tool for concealing unpleasant truths, shaping the image of a paralyzed leader or, conversely, a grandmaster of strategy. It was thanks to this combination of bright legend and hidden difficulties that Stalin's image in 1941 remained a powerful and alluring symbol for millions. Nevertheless, behind this facade lay many dramatic stories that influenced not only the course of the war, but also relations within the country. The next stage of our research will allow us to gain a deeper understanding of how internal politics and leadership influenced the further development of events and the fate of millions. Let's start with the fact that June 1941 was a time of tremendous hardship for the Soviet Union. It was then that the Great Patriotic War began, when Nazi Germany suddenly attacked the country. At the center of all this chaos was Joseph Stalin, a figure who sparked much debate and speculation. Was he paralyzed by fear and indecision, or did he act as a grandmaster of strategy, subtly controlling the course of events? Historians and researchers disagree about Stalin's role in the first months of the war. On the one hand, It is known that he refused to believe in the possibility of a large-scale invasion for a long time, despite numerous warnings from his intelligence services. Such skepticism created the impression of a lack of understanding of the threat, or even indifference to reality. However, there are also versions that it was precisely this period of uncertainty that allowed the leadership to build a long-term strategy of resistance and mobilization of the country. Some conspiracy theorists argue that Stalin may have deliberately ignored intelligence reports in order to lure the enemy into a trap, deliberately demonstrating weakness and unpreparedness. In their view, this contributed to the delay of the German offensive, giving the Red Army time to strengthen its defenses and organize its resources. However, as analysis of documents and contemporary accounts shows, this position is unlikely and serves more as a rationalization of the catastrophic mistakes of the first months. No less interesting is the question of how Stalin's personal qualities influenced his decisions at this critical moment. It is well known that he had previously been a master of intrigue and harsh politics, but the war demanded a different kind of leadership, a willingness to listen to advisors, react quickly to changes, and take responsibility for defeats. Nevertheless, the first months of the war were marred by brutal repression in the army and the party, which weakened the command structure and created an atmosphere of fear. Many sources indicate that it was in 1941 that Stalin experienced serious internal doubts and psychological stress. His plans for the future were often disrupted by the reality of the fighting, and those close to him sought to convey the need for changes in tactics. This conflict between the desire to control everything and the need to trust his subordinates may have looked like paralysis, but in fact, it demonstrated the complexity and scale of the tasks facing the leader. When considering alternative versions, one cannot ignore the theory of secret negotiations between the USSR and Germany at the beginning of the war. Some researchers suggest that Stalin was trying to buy time by playing a hidden diplomatic game, but there is no evidence to confirm such contacts. Perhaps this reflects a general tendency for people to seek hidden scenarios in events that are difficult to explain unequivocally. The image of a paralyzed leader became widespread after the war, when the publication of secret archives revealed the tragedy of the first days of the attack and the loss of many cities. This version became dominant in popular culture and military historiography, but careful analysis shows that Stalin actively intervened in military management, making complex and sometimes contradictory decisions. His strategic genius was evident during the preparation and conclusion of the conflict. It is interesting to note that by the end of the year, the leader of the USSR had changed before the eyes of his contemporaries. His speech became more confident, his decisions more decisive, and his actions more purposeful. This gives rise to the idea that the crisis of the first stage of the war was not only a test for the country, but also a profound personal turning point for Stalin, allowing him to gather himself and focus on the future. It remains important to note that all attempts to provide a definitive answer to questions about Stalin's role in 1941 remain focused on facts and interpretations. Numerous documents, memoirs, and studies continue to be published, providing new details that sometimes confirm and sometimes refute existing perceptions. Thus, the political leader of that period appears before us not as a simple monolith of ideas and behaviors, but as a complex, multifaceted person with both weaknesses and remarkable abilities. His actions simultaneously inspired fear, respect, and bewilderment. Perhaps it is this duality that generates constant interest in his personality and forms the fine line between real history and conspiracy theories. It should also be noted that understanding Stalin and his roles in 1941 is impossible without taking into account the general context of the time: international pressure, internal moods in the country, and the state of the army and economy. These variables played out not only in military drama, but also in a complex psychological spectacle of state power. This multifaceted vision opens up new horizons for research and analysis, allowing us not only to contrast myths and reality, but also to gain a deeper understanding of the very nature of leadership in times of disaster. Ultimately, it is this approach that allows us to better understand not only Stalin, but also the complex history of all times. Moving on to the next section, we will focus on the details of military operations and domestic policy that had a decisive influence on the course of the Great Patriotic War. This part will reveal the strategic moments in more detail and show how the personality of the leader correlated with the scale of events. At the beginning of our study, we try to understand one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. In 1941, Joseph Stalin appears before us not as an unambiguous hero, but as a complex personality, balancing on the brink of paralysis and grand mastery. What did this man mean to the Soviet Union in that fateful year when the fate of the country hung in the balance? The answers to these questions help us not only to better understand the historical past, but also to draw lessons that can help future generations find the true meaning of leadership and responsibility. When studying Stalin's personality, we encounter contradictory facts. On the one hand, his actions in the first months of the war raise questions about his inability to respond quickly to threats. Indeed, the leader's mood was tense, and his decisions sometimes seemed indecisive. His desire to control every detail often led to delays in taking necessary action. Many historians note that excessive control and fear of making mistakes delayed critical decisions, which cost the country dearly in the first months of the Great Patriotic War. Nevertheless, Stalin's strategic depth of thought should not be forgotten. Despite the paralysis at the beginning of the war, he was ultimately able to mobilize the country's enormous resources and implement unexpected tactical decisions. It was under his leadership that the plan for a counteroffensive in the Battle of Moscow was developed, which marked the beginning of a turning point in the war. These victories were not accidental. They were the result of hard work, systematic analysis of the situation, and the ability to plan for the long term. In 1941, Stalin was not just the face of the country. He became a symbol of how a leader must be able to adapt quickly and rethink his views under pressure. An important lesson we can learn from the history of this period is an understanding of the complexity of the role of a leader in a crisis. Leadership is not only the ability to dictate one's will, but also the ability to listen, trust proven advisors, and not be afraid to change strategy. Stalin's mistakes in the first months of the war point to the danger of absolute power without an adequate system of feedback. This part of history serves as a reminder that even the toughest hand must show flexibility in order not to undermine the stability of the system. When studying Stalin's personality and his role in 1941, one cannot fail to note the scale of human loss and suffering that the country faced. His decisions directly affected the lives of millions of citizens, which placed an enormous responsibility on the leader. It is important to understand that leadership in wartime is not only about strategy and tactics, but also about moral choices that have consequences for society. These lessons are still relevant today, as the world faces new challenges that require balanced decisions and responsibility for the future. The phenomenon of Stalin in 1941 offers us a unique opportunity to reflect on how personal qualities influence the course of history. His will to power and harsh methods of governance, on the one hand, yielded results, but on the other, led to enormous costs. He was not just a key player, but a complex man who simultaneously fought external enemies and internal fears. Based on this, we can conclude that leadership is always a balance between firmness and humanity, between strength and awareness of one's limitations. An equally important aspect for analysis is understanding how external circumstances influenced Stalin's personality. In 1941, the Soviet Union found itself under a powerful blow from fascist aggression and internal problems. The war required the rapid mobilization of all resources, as well as the ability to innovate and cooperate. Stalin was faced with the need not only to conduct military operations, but also to resolve social and economic issues, which turned him into not just a military leader, but also the chief organizer of the country's life. These reflections offer an important lesson for future leaders. It is impossible to successfully manage a complex system while ignoring the need for collective participation and diversity of opinion. Stalin's story teaches us that even the strongest individuals need to be surrounded by people who are willing to offer alternative views and critically evaluate current decisions. The lessons of this period, marked by tragedy and victory, underscore the importance of teamwork, listening, and learning from others to achieve a common goal. When considering Stalin's role in 1941, one must not forget the importance of propaganda and information policy. The war was accompanied by harsh censorship, manipulation, and the creation of an image of an infallible leader, which ultimately influenced the perception of events both within the country and abroad. This circumstance raises questions about the objectivity of the historical picture and the importance of considering diverse sources for a complete understanding of the era. The lesson for us is that control over information and transparency must go hand in hand with responsibility for the decisions made. In the end, when we look at the results and lessons from Stalin's role in 1941, it's clear that he was an important part of history. He embodied both the tragedy and the potential of his country, reflecting all the complexity of human nature and the demands of the times. Understanding this paradox helps us not only to better understand the past, but also to prepare for the challenges that await humanity in the future, forcing us to be more attentive and responsible in our choice of leaders and development strategies. This reflection leads us smoothly to the next stage of our study, in which we will examine the consequences of the lessons learned and their impact on the present day. Reflecting on how historical examples can be useful to us today allows us to look at the topic of leadership and responsibility from a new angle. In this way, we will continue to explore the complex interrelationships between the past and the present, preparing for the challenges of the future with greater understanding and wisdom.